John Stone was born in Framingham, Massachusetts, on April 13, 1702, the sixth child of Nathaniel Stone and Sarah Waite. Around 1730, John relocated to Rutland, Massachusetts, where he acquired a large tract of land on the shore of Muscapauge Pond on which he settled. In 1732, his father deeded to him certain lands in the Framingham area as well. As in days of old in England, being a landowner came with certain civic privileges. John was appointed Justice of the Peace for Worcester County on January 25, 1754, a position renewed on January 21, 1762. At that time, this was an office of great distinction within the colonies. In those days, John's life revolved around a tightly knit community committed to their church and their farms. The town was characterized by communal land ownership and an interrelated close-knit family network, often intermarrying with other Rutland families and even distant cousins. He served as a private in Captain Samuel Wright's Framingham Company from July 19 to August 23, 1725. These expeditions ventured far into the wilderness to keep watch on their former native enemies of King Philip's War. Though most of the colonial settlements in Massachusetts had become established by 1725, with few skirmishes occurring, the wounds of the War of 1675 were far-reaching and not easily forgotten. Captain Samuel Wright, born in Sudbury in 1670 to Captain Edward Wright and Hannah Upson, was considered the first settler of Rutland, Massachusetts. He held numerous public offices including selectman, assessor, town clerk, meeting moderator, justice of the peace, church deacon, militia captain, and property surveyor. He was reputed to have built and kept the first public tavern in Rutland, located just opposite the meeting house where much of the town's business was conducted. Given Wright's military exploits and public prominence, it is understandable that John Stone would follow him in many of his endeavors. Luckily, many of the Massachusetts militia were led by men of Captain Wright's caliber. Long before the French and Indian War, members of the Stone family had already faced the fires of war. Some had served in earlier colonial conflicts, including King William's War, another transatlantic struggle between England and France. One such ancestor, Daniel Stone, represented his lineage on the battlefield. Born in 1668 in Sudbury, Daniel was the son of Deacon Daniel Stone and Mary Moore Ward, and was the grandson of Elder John, and the great-grandson of the patriarch Deacon Gregory Stone. King William's War was largely a series of brutal frontier raids, with little lasting gain for either side. However, in 1690, the Massachusetts Assembly made a momentous decision that would entangle Daniel Stone in one of the more ambitious, and ill-fated, campaigns of the war. The Assembly appointed Sir William Phips as Major General and tasked him with leading an expedition against French Acadia. In March of that year, Phips sailed out of Boston determined to capture Port Royal, the French capital of Acadia. Though the mission was technically a success, it was hardly a heroic conquest. The poorly defended fort, manned by only 70 Frenchmen without artillery, surrendered to Phips' 450 militiamen and 7 armed ships without firing a shot. Phips allowed his men to ransack the churches and pillage the town, then repeated the process at other nearby settlements. He returned to Boston basking in self-praise and public acclaim, comparing his exploits to those of Alexander the Great. Buoyed by his so-called triumph, Phips set his sights on Quebec, anticipating another easy victory. This time, he assembled a much larger force, 4 warships, 30 transports, and 2,200 men. However, his troops were undisciplined and untrained, and Phips himself lacked any real military experience. Unlike Port Royal, Quebec was defended by seasoned French soldiers. Then, Phips made the fatal mistake of anchoring his flagship directly in the line of fire from the fort's elevated cannon. While the French rained fire down upon the English ships, the British could barely return fire due to their poor positioning. The result was a disaster. The English fleet was shattered and the 1,200 men who landed were decimated. Daniel Stone and his fellow soldiers ashore fled in disarray, leaving behind 5 field guns. After 8 harrowing days, Phipps ordered a retreat. By the time he limped back to Boston, the debacle had been reframed as a noble effort. He falsely reported only 30 dead, ignoring the 150 killed in battle and the nearly 1,000 lost to shipwrecks, smallpox, and typhus. Miraculously, Daniel Stone survived. In 1737, the survivors, or their heirs, petitioned the Massachusetts government for compensation for the Quebec expedition's catastrophic failure. Since Daniel had died in 1702, his son Micah Stone appeared in his place. But colonial bureaucracy moved slowly, and it wasn't until 1768, more than 30 years later, that the grant was finally approved. The township awarded to the veterans' families what would become Bethel, Maine, with Daniel's grandson, Josiah Stone, among the recipients. Thus, even in defeat, the Stone family's sacrifice earned them a small piece of New England's future, a legacy rooted not just in endurance, but in land, lineage, and memory. But while Daniel was trying to get back home alive, his first cousin Samuel Stone was riding with his troop of horse under the command of Captain Isaac Clark, all from Framingham. The troop spent their time scouting for native insurgents throughout the summer of 1725. When not in the saddle, Samuel took on the duties of the troop's clerk. Deacon John Stone was married first at Sudbury on January 13, 1731, to his 18-year-old cousin Elizabeth Stone, daughter of Captain Samuel Stone III. She gave birth to 10 children before passing away in Rutland on May 21, 1751. John remarried in Holden, Massachusetts, in December 1776, to Mrs. Mary Stratton Brown, born in Concord in 1719. She was the daughter of Samuel and Sarah Allen Stratton of Rutland, and the widow of Timothy Brown of Holden. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, tensions brewed between England and France, leading to the conflict known as the 7 Years' War, the First World War in history. What began as a European struggle quickly spread to the American colonies over disputed land claims, especially in the Ohio River Valley. Both Britain and France sought to expand westward, increasing their influence and control over North America, drawing Native American tribes like the Seneca, Delaware, and Shawnee into the conflict as well. Both French and British claimed the Ohio Valley, but only one could prevail. To reinforce their claims, the French began building forts throughout the region, from Lake Erie to present-day Pittsburgh at the forks of the Ohio River. The British responded by constructing forts of their own. However, it was only a matter of time before the opposing forces collided, whether by accident or design. The first major confrontation occurred in 1754 at Jumonville Glen, where a young George Washington led a surprise attack that ignited the French and Indian War. This was brought about when tensions in the Ohio Valley, as a French-Canadian force drove off a British work crew attempting to build Fort Prince George on land the French claimed. The British sent a colonial force under Washington to defend the site. The French countered by sending Ensign Joseph Cowlin to Jumonville with a diplomatic warning. But Washington, along with a small band of Mingo warriors, ambushed the French party. 10 Frenchmen were killed, 1 wounded, and 21 captured. Ensign Jumonville, though wounded, was killed by the Mingo leader, Half King, with a tomahawk blow to the skull. The killing's motive remains debated, but its consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The violence at Jumonville Glen was swiftly followed by the Battle of Fort Necessity later that year. Washington and his men, overwhelmed, were forced to surrender to a larger French force. With these opening blows, the die was cast, and the blood began to flow. What began as a colonial skirmish soon escalated into a global war. Once again, the Massachusetts colony bore the brunt of battle, pouring troops and resources into the conflict. Many colonial leaders gained valuable military experience that would later shape the American Revolution. However, the war caused a heavy financial burden as trade was disrupted and markets closed. To cover costs, the British imposed taxes on the colonies beyond their means to pay, a grave mistake that sowed seeds of further unrest. Although fighting began in 1754, an official declaration of war was not made until 1756. As the conflict progressed, British military strategy shifted from open battle to capturing French forts, aiming to control the contested region through strategic strongholds. When the drums of war echoed across the rugged hills and quiet villages of Massachusetts, the Stone family stood ready. Like so many times before, they did not hesitate. From hamlets tucked deep in the forests to towns nestled along the coast, they all came at the call, sons of farmers, landowners, blacksmiths, and laborers. The Stone name was among the first on every muster roll, etched in ink and duty. The colonies needed men, and they needed them quickly. Those who arrived to volunteer were sorted, assessed not by birth except in the officer corps or reputation, but by capability and circumstance. Many were assigned to the provincial troops, those curious, in-between forces, soldiers, yes, but not quite regulars of His Majesty's army. They were the beating heart of the colonial military machine, raised anew each spring and disbanded with the snow. Unlike the militias that drilled on village greens and responded to local alarms, provincial troops were full-time fighters, committed for the season, but only the season. They marched under banners chosen by colonial governors, their officers often seasoned men, who returned to command year after year. Yet the ranks were filled with the young and the landless, those with little to lose and less to tie them to hearth and home. Society could spare them. The quota system saw to their numbers. Town by town, a count was made, and names were drawn. Some went eagerly, others resignedly, but go they did. And when the Stone boys were called, they did not flinch. They answered not just for themselves, but for Massachusetts, for their name, and for the promise that, in war, even the most ordinary men might carve history with musket and resolve. Yet for all their zeal and sacrifice, the provincial troops were looked down upon by the very empire they fought to uphold. During the long and brutal campaigns of the French and Indian War, the British High Command regarded these colonial soldiers, Massachusetts men like the Stones, as inferior, untrained, and unworthy of standing in the same line of battle as the red-coated regulars. Orders trickled down with a thinly veiled disdain. The provincials were to wield shovels instead of muskets, tasked with building fortifications, felling trees for roads, and hauling supplies through mud and blood. The combat, the honor, the real war, it was reserved for the professionals, men of supposed breeding and training. This arrogant philosophy would fester in the years that followed, fermenting into something far more volatile. By the time revolution kindled across the colonies, the British were still clinging to their illusions of superiority. They dismissed the fighting spirit of the provincial-born patriot, believing him incapable of matching the might of the King's army. But in the smoke-choked forests of New York, the frozen hills of New Jersey, and the fields of Saratoga, that condescension was paid for with blooded redcoats lying cold in the dirt. The ghosts of the Stone family, and countless others like them, stood in grim testament to a truth the Empire had refused to see, that resolve, not rank, wins wars. Of course, it wasn't only the sons of Massachusetts who answered the call. From the rocky farms of Connecticut, the bustling ports of Rhode Island, and the forested valleys of New Hampshire, they came in equal measure, grim-faced, calloused-handed, and bound by a common cause. These men, like the Stones, were not militia, though many had trained as such in village greens and under the wary eyes of town elders. No, these were provincial troops too, bound not by local defense, but by the promise, and peril, of the frontier. They enlisted for combat alone, with no illusion of permanence. They were not soldiers by trade, but became so by necessity, signing their names beneath banners bearing the seals of their individual colonies. Each province paid its own, managing the costs of war one man, one bullet, one ration at a time. Their service was seasonal, but their hardships were anything but. They bled beside the regulars, froze in the wilderness, and buried their own in shallow graves carved from frost-bitten ground. Yet still they came and still they marched. They marched not for glory, but for duty. And while the British command might have dismissed them as second-rate, these provincial troops became the backbone of every major push into the frontier, the quiet strength that held the edges of empire together. And in the years to come, when revolution lit the skies, it would be these same men, once treated as laborious and lackeys, who would fire the first true shots of independence. Not all who bore arms in those turbulent days were provincials. The militia, ever watchful, ever ready, formed the other half of the colonial sword. These were men drawn from their farms, their shops, their fishing boats and blacksmith forges. One moment, they were fathers, merchants, and neighbors, the next, they stood musket in hand, ready to defend hearth and home. They were not soldiers by profession nor by long-term design, they were citizens answering the call in times of crisis. The militia was the colony's heartbeat, pulsing beneath the surface of daily life. They trained a few days each year, drilled in the town commons beneath fluttering flags and stern-eyed captains, but their true purpose was singular: to be ready when danger came knocking. They were the home guard, defenders of villages, guardians of families, and in many ways, the quiet foundation upon which the larger war effort was built. To the provincial companies, the militia became an ever-replenishing well. When enlistments thinned or losses mounted, it was to the local militias that officers turned, drawing from their ranks men who had not planned for war, but would go nonetheless. Not all had the fire of ambition in their eyes, some went grudgingly, others with dread, but still they went. And though history would speak more loudly of the battles fought in faraway woods and grand fields, it was in the barns and churchyards of small towns, where muskets were stored and men gathered by candlelight, that the true strength of colonial resistance first took root. The ranks of the colonial armies were not filled by patriotism alone. Beneath the fluttering flags and rousing speeches lay a more complicated truth, one shaped as much by pragmatism and prejudice as by any noble call to arms. Colonial governments, driven by quotas and the insatiable appetite of war, had little interest in where a man came from so long as he could shoulder a musket. Legislators, while often blind to justice, were keen-eyed when it came to need. They recruited where society hesitated, among the Indians, free persons of color, indentured servants, and even vagrants. For those with no land and little standing, the army was both a sentence and a strange kind of opportunity. To entice those without property, the colonies offered coin, a bounty for every name signed, everybody mustered into service. For men on the fringes of society, it was sometimes the only honest wage they could hope to earn. And when coin failed, the draft came. It landed hardest upon those seen as troublesome, the idle, the rowdy, the young men who drank too deeply and fought too often. These were the ones the magistrates were most eager to send to the frontier. But not all men were bound to fight. The wealthier citizens, planters, merchants, sons of respected families could sidestep the bloodshed. With silver in hand, they hired substitutes to march in their place. It was the poor who bled, while the privileged watched the war from behind sturdy doors. Still, the colonies met their quotas. In 1758 alone, the northern provinces rallied and pushed forward over 17,000 men, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island bearing the brunt. The South, distant and slower to move, offered far fewer. And so, the army grew, an uneasy brotherhood forged not from equality, but necessity. Among them were stone men, Indian scouts, runaway apprentices, freedmen, and farmers. Their reasons were as varied as their names, but their fate would be the same: to march, to fight, and, for many, to fall in lands that would remember neither rank nor reason, only the sacrifice. The French and Indian War would end in 1763, but it would leave behind more than empty canteens and graves. It left a generation of men who knew how to fight, who had stood shoulder to shoulder in battle, who had learned to march, to build, to lead. It left men with calluses not just on their hands, but on their hearts. By 1775, the framework had already been set in place: the militias, the provincial companies, the officers who had once answered to governors, soon were raising their voices to Congress instead. The British had trained their enemy without ever knowing it. This upcoming revolution wouldn't begin in Boston. It began the first time they told them they weren't real soldiers, just colonials. Ironically, the British trained them to fight, taught them how to build a fort, how to march into cannon fire, how to bury their dead and still move forward. But they never taught the colonials how to forget. All it would take would be a spark to change their status from subjects to Americans. What Britain had built was no longer under their control. The British of 1755 had forged their own reckoning. But one of those subjects they sarcastically spoke of was Francis Stone, the oldest son of Jonathan Stone, who was too clever for farm work and too restless for the pulpit. In the spring of 1758, with the forests thawing and drums beating once more, Francis enlisted in the provincial army. Francis Stone was apprenticed at the age of 14 to Ebenezer Warren in Spencer, Massachusetts, to learn the trade of tanning. However, his training was cut short when the escalating demands of war required more soldiers to fill the ranks. Answering the call, the young teenager put pen to paper, making his mark with quill and ink, and enlisted in the military. He joined the ranks of Colonel Andrew Dalrymple's regiment on or about August 9, 1755, serving under the command of Colonel Eleazar Fitch. Among his comrades was Private Samuel Morris, the company clerk, who diligently recorded the unit's movements and activities throughout the war, leaving behind a detailed account of their experiences. Francis had enlisted of his own free will, or so he told himself. In truth, it may very well have been because his father had been killed at Crown Point on September 8, 1755, under the command of Captain Solomon Keyes. As the oldest son, Francis would inherit his father's land once he became of age. But that was then, this was now. So, the war, at least, offered a kind of purpose, revenge as well as a £6 bounty paid up front for a 14-year-old boy. But what was so important about Crown Point that his father had to die trying to capture it? The answer lies in its strategic significance. Control over the waterways and forts in the Ohio Valley and along Lake Champlain was key to determining the outcome of the war. Crown Point, home to the French Fort St. Frederick, was a vital stronghold on Lake Champlain. From there, the French launched raids into British-held territories and maintained control over the critical corridor leading into the Hudson River Valley. Its capture was not just another battle, it was one of the two primary objectives of the entire British campaign, a linchpin in the struggle for dominance in North America. To accomplish these objectives, the British launched an offensive on September 8, 1755, against the French at Crown Point, relying heavily on colonial militia and their Mohawk allies. This engagement, later known as the Battle of Lake George, was a tactical victory for the British. However, they ultimately failed to capture Crown Point. The commanding general reported that the troops were too exhausted and lacked the heavy artillery necessary to lay siege to the French stronghold. Instead of pressing forward, the British shifted their focus to fortifying their position. They began constructing Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George and made significant improvements to Fort Edward, located further south along the Hudson River. Additionally, they secured the critical Lake George-Hudson River portage, which effectively blocked French forces from advancing southward via the water route, at least for a time. Jonathan Stone had marched into battle that day. Several others bearing the Stone name also took part in the fight, reflecting the deep involvement of the family in the conflict. Among them were Lieutenant Joseph Stone of Brookfield and Lieutenant Samuel Stone of Framingham, both serving in Captain Obadiah Cooley's company. Josiah Stone, serving under Captain William Reed, would later give his life in the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Saratoga on September 19, 1777. In Captain Benjamin Wood's company were Joseph Stone and Eliphalet Stone, while 3 more members of the Stone family would go on to add their names to the muster rolls. These men survived the war and lived to recount their experiences to their grandchildren, preserving their legacy in family memory. However, the French could not allow Fort William Henry to remain in place, threatening their vital transportation and communication routes between Lake George and Lake Champlain. Regaining control of this corridor was essential to their hold over the region. In response, French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm led a formidable force of 8,000, composed of French regulars, Canadian militia, and a large coalition of Native American allies from various tribes, toward the fort. Awaiting them was Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe, commanding a garrison of just 2,300 men made up of British regulars and provincial militia from several colonies, with a significant number from Massachusetts. Within days, the outcome of the siege became clear. The British defenders were isolated, racked by disease, and vastly outnumbered. They were also dangerously low on ammunition and supplies, with no reinforcements coming from nearby Fort Edward. From every colony in New England, the urgent call went out to send reinforcements to Fort William Henry before it was too late. The Stones, true to their sense of duty, responded without hesitation. Each man gathered his rifle and marched out with his unit, determined to help defend the besieged fort. But the distances these relief columns had to travel were staggering. One such column was Lieutenant Josiah Merriam's company, under the command of John Chandler's regiment, which included Private Uriah Stone of Framingham, Massachusetts. Unaware of how late they already were, the company began their 98-mile march on August 10, reaching Sheffield 8 days later, still with 111 miles left to go. By the time they received word that the fort had fallen, there was nothing left to do but turn around and return home. A similar story unfolded for Private Nathan Stone, Captain Isaac Stone, and Lieutenant Isaac Stone, all from Sudbury. They served in Peter Davis's company, part of Colonel Timothy Ruggles's regiment. Lieutenant Stone served as second-in-command to Captain Davis. Their company had marched out of Rutland, Massachusetts, on August 9 and reached Kinderhook, New York, on August 28, having covered an exhausting 250 miles. Tragically, Nathan Stone would not survive the summer, most likely falling victim to typhus, a common killer among troops during that campaign. Lieutenant Samuel Stone of Rutland had also taken part in that expedition, even though the effort came too late. One of the Stone men with a direct connection to Fort William Henry was Sergeant Henry Stone of Dorchester, Massachusetts. In 1755, he had taken part in the expedition to Crown Point, serving in Captain Nathaniel Blake's company under Colonel Jonathan Bagley's regiment. After the British secured a tactical victory in the region, his regiment remained behind to help construct Fort William Henry. Henry remained at the fort until October 12, 1756, at which point he fell ill and likely returned home. While no further military records detail his service, it is known that he survived the war and lived until 1784. In hindsight, his illness may have been a stroke of fortune. By leaving when he did, he avoided the horrific massacre that followed. With no reinforcements coming to his aid and his garrison critically low on ammunition and supplies, Colonel Monro had no choice but to negotiate surrender terms with the French. On August 9, 1757, he agreed to capitulate under the condition that his troops be granted the honors of war, permitted to march out of Fort William Henry with their muskets though without ammunition and flags flying, under French escort to the nearby British-held Fort Edward. However, the surrender quickly descended into tragedy. Many of the Native American allies, feeling deprived of the spoils of war, including prisoners, goods, and scalps, ignored the agreed terms. As the British column began its withdrawal, chaos erupted. The warriors attacked the unarmed soldiers and accompanying civilians, slaughtering and scalping over 200 men, women, and children. Many others were taken captive during the confusion, never to be heard from again. Despite General Montcalm's efforts to restore order and rescue the victims, the massacre at Fort William Henry remains one of the most harrowing incidents of the French and Indian War. Almost a year later, the British returned to the battlefield, this time with vengeance in their hearts. A powerful expeditionary army, bolstered by Massachusetts militia, set out once more to lay siege to the formidable French fortress at Louisbourg. Strategically located on Cape Breton Island, Louisbourg was of immense importance because it commanded access to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River, the vital artery leading to Quebec and the rest of New France. Beyond its military significance, Louisbourg was also a major naval base, an essential fishing port, and a crucial hub for trade and communication between France and its North American colonies. Capturing it was key to establishing British naval dominance in the North Atlantic and launching further campaigns into the heart of French Canada. The British laid siege to the fortress for 7 grueling weeks. Finally, on July 26, 1758, the French defenders surrendered. With Louisbourg fallen, French naval power in the region was effectively crushed, clearing the path for the British to turn their sights on Quebec, the stronghold of New France. To ensure Louisbourg could never again serve as a threat, the British demolished its fortifications after the victory, eliminating any chance of it being reoccupied by French forces in the future. Now, 3 years later, the British returned to finish the job and capture Fort St. Frederick. Among the ranks was a fresh recruit, 14-year-old Francis Stone, still clutching his enlistment papers tucked safely in his coat. Around him were a diverse group of comrades: a runaway servant from Dorchester, who had falsified his age to join the fight, an Abenaki warrior, proud and skilled, and a freeman of color, who saw the army as a way to earn enough money to open a cobbler's shop after the war. Despite their varied backgrounds, young Francis fit right in with his tent mates, united by the shared hardships and hopes of the campaign ahead. Across the square, Francis glanced at the line of red-coated regulars, neat, practiced, and unsmiling. In their faces, he saw the same disdain his uncle showed toward the chimney sweep, the stable boy, and the dogs that barked too loudly. As Francis passed, one of the soldiers snorted under his breath, muttering, "Rabble, just rabble." The only thought that stirred in Francis's mind, "Well, we'll see who's left standing come October." The troops left within the week, marching into the untouched wilderness toward the northern front, where rumors whispered of a great battle waiting ahead. Foremost, the frontier was nothing more than a word on a map, a distant concept. But Francis would soon learn the harsh truth: some maps are drawn not with ink, but with blood. They soon discovered that the forests of the northern frontier swallowed every sound. By the third week of June, Francis Stone had learned how the trees could press so close together that even a whisper was stifled. The column wound its way through the dense woods along the Hudson River, each step mired in mud, tangled roots, and fallen limbs. Sunlight filtered through in narrow beams, casting shifting shadows. Above the clank of canteens and the occasional grunt of a mule, an almost tangible tension hung in the air, almost as if the forest itself knew the storm that was coming. They marched on, soon joined by other colonial companies from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Together, they formed part of General Abercrombie's Grand Army, a formidable force of 17,000 men, the largest ever assembled in North America up to that time. Francis had never seen so many men in one place, as the column stretched behind them for miles. Redcoats gleamed at the head of the line, stiff and unreadable, while the provincials, sweating and battered, brought up the rear or marched in parallel columns through ravines and lowland thickets. They built roads as they went, hacking through forest and marsh. Francis' palms were already blistered before reaching halfway to their destination. One night, gathered around a low fire deep in the woods near Fort Edward, the men talked quietly about those they had already lost to accidents, drownings, and the relentless fever. Rumors swirled that they would soon be facing 5,000 French soldiers, along with all the native warriors from the North Country. They feared the enemy already knew they were coming. After all, how could anyone move 17,000 men up a river without the wind carrying word of their advance? One soldier even claimed to have heard that the general demanded a direct assault, no flanking maneuvers, just a straight march to storm the walls. The grim response was always the same: "Then we'll die standing straight up." And that's exactly how it happened. 14-year-old Francis tightened his grip on his musket. His hands were calloused now, stained with pine pitch and sweat. He thought often of his father and of home, not with longing, but with a strange sense of detachment. It was as if the house in Leicester, where he was born, had slipped away into a fading dream, distant and unreal amid the harshness of war. Soon, the army reached the shores of Lake George in early July and ferried across in flatboats beneath a blistering sun. Beyond the water, rising like a crouched beast from the dense woods, stood Fort Carillon, its stone and log walls bristling with cannon, surrounded by abattis and sharpened stakes, manned by hardened French regulars and their native allies. General Abercrombie wasted no time. He neither reconnoitred the enemy position nor delayed the assault. On July 8, 1758, Francis was ordered into the first wave of attack. There was no artillery support and no scaling ladders, only volleys of musket fire and orders to climb the fortified heights. The abattis tore at the men like vicious claws. Sharpened logs crisscrossed in dense layers turned the hillside into a deadly trap. Men fell screaming, shot, stabbed, or impaled, while blood soaked the summer grass beneath them. The redcoats charged and fell. The provincials charged and fell alongside them. Death knew not either. Francis watched helplessly as his friends went down under a hail of murderous fire, just as an officer's head vanished in a sudden flash of smoke and bone. But he kept moving forward. Fire, kneel, load, stand, fire again. Later, much later, he could not remember how he had crossed the abatis. Only that he screamed louder than he'd ever known possible, and saw his bayonet sink deep into something that bled. By nightfall, the field was covered with the dead and dying, over 2,000 British and provincial casualties, and yet the fort still stood. General Abercrombie retreated the next day. They buried the dead in shallow graves, redcoats and provincials alike, before ferrying the survivors back across Lake George. Francis, blood-stained and hollow-eyed, sat in the boat surrounded by men pressing in on all sides. In the heavy silence, his thoughts drifted away from glory, honor, or even survival. Instead, he thought bitterly of the arrogance of the redcoats, of the governor's coin tucked in his pocket, and of how men like his friends, brave beyond reckoning, had bled and died for commanders who saw them as nothing more than bodies in uniforms. Now it was time to return home. However, the seeds of future rebellion were now planted, not in speeches, nor in taxes, but in blood, spilled for a crown that neither knew their names nor cared. Francis Stone would return home that fall, but the memories of the battlefield would never truly leave him. The war had changed him forever. More fighting lay ahead, but when the drums of revolution began to beat years later, Francis already knew the rhythm by heart. Deacon John Stone of Rutland passed away on October 11, 1776, at the age of 74, according to his gravestone. He lived long enough to witness his family's seeds of independence bloom into rebellion. His beloved colony of Massachusetts was at the very moment of his death, fighting for complete independence from England as John crossed the river to the other side. He was buried in the old burying ground cemetery in Rutland, where he joined his first wife, Elizabeth. His story, and that of the Stone family, is like that of many early settlers, is interwoven with the birth of a nation, one he helped shape through his service, his civic duties, and his enduring legacy.